A priest might be present, depending on the family's customs. Women of the household, slaves, and matrons moved like orchestra members, each fulfilling a role. The physician arrived not in a lab coat, but as the family's medically literate practitioner, someone who could read a body and produce words that would be accepted in the courts. And then there was the veiled wooden figure, a small draped object that ancient writers name with a mixture of contempt and curiosity, mutinus tutinus. Mutinus tutinus appears in the Roman record as a veiled phallic object associated with fertility and with certain obscene rites. Ancient authors, Augustine, Arnobius, Lactantius among them, mention such figures when they wish to condemn what they saw as pagan indecencies. And a few Roman antiquarian sources, like Varro, refer to ritual objects connected with marriage and fertility. But it matters to say that what exactly mutinus tutinus represented and how it was used in private households is debated. Some writers describe a ritual presence that is both invocatory and forensic. The idol serves to witness, to preside over a staged act, to make visible a private happening. Some historians propose that the figure was used to imply divine sanction for the consummation, while others read it as a tool of social coercion, designed to shame resistance by making the scene public and sanctioned. That veil, covering a modest block of wood, was more than a prop. In a society where lineage and property were tangled together, where a marriage was a transfer of legal authority known as manus, establishing the facts of union carried real consequences. Manus meant that the wife entered into the potestas, the legal power, of her husband, a movement through which dowries, inheritances, and succession lines were affected. If a husband needed heirs, or if his status required proof of a legitimate child for inheritance, then ensuring that the marriage had been consummated and that the bride was not already compromised became important beyond mere honor. Evidence was the mechanism that turned social expectation into legal result. Roman law did not often speak bluntly about the intimate details of a wedding night. Much of what we know comes from scattered legal texts, medical fragments, and the moralizing critiques of later Christian writers. These sources hint at a two-stage logic of verification. First came preliminary assurances. Physicians or midwives could examine a bride. Some sources suggest for signs associated with virginity, or observe reproductive health in ways that ancient medical writers discussed, albeit in imperfect and often biased ways. Second, within the household, a ritual could be staged to produce witnesses who would later attest, if necessary, to the consummation. The pronuba sworn testimony, the presence of household witnesses, and a physician's record could together form a body of proof admissible in social and legal contexts. We must be careful here. Ancient medical texts do not provide modern, definitive diagnostics, and the idea of virginity in antiquity is not identical to contemporary biological or cultural categories. The evidence is fragmentary, and many historians warn against reading later prejudices into earlier practices. Yet the pattern that emerges from the sources is clear enough to suggest a system. Bodies were turned into evidence, ritual and medicine were enlisted to create documentation, and witnesses, especially reputable women like the pronuba, served as guarantors. That night in Marcus Petronius Rufus's home proceeded as a choreography of scrutiny. Lamps were kept not fully extinguished. The doorway might remain ajar so that the events inside could, if necessary, be observed or evidenced. The pronuba took a place where she could see and later testify. The physician recorded observations in shorthand, a line that could be used in argument, in a dispute over dowry, or in questions of legitimacy. A cloth was lifted. The wooden image of mutinus tutinus, covered in a modest drape, was presented with the kind of matter-of-factness that in other settings would have been comic or profane. Ritual words might be spoken by the pronuba or a priest, but the effect was not merely devotional. The items on display, spindle, torch, nuts, a veiled object, were part of a vocabulary meant to connect the private act with public meaning. Ancient authors sometimes describe such scenes with indignant relish. Augustine, for instance, in his polemics against pagan customs, mentions obscene rites associated with fertility and marriage, condemning them as signs of moral decay. Arnobius and Lactantius offer similar accounts, though always with the disclaimer that their sources and their purpose, running paganism down to build Christian moral authority, shape how they present these events. When pagan practices are described by hostile voices, the temptation is to accept the worst readings. Historians, therefore, read these passages with a caution that keeps the outrage but demands corroboration. Why did families go through this? The answer returns to property and social order. A dowry was not simply a bride's ornament, it was an economic instrument. If a woman entered a marriage without the protections of legal process, a marriage unconsummated, a disputed dowry, or a child of uncertain paternity, her husband's household could face financial and reputational vulnerabilities. In the event of a contested inheritance, a wife's sexual history could become a tool for inclusion or exclusion. The prenuptial and postnuptial rituals that converged on the wedding night were therefore instruments for producing certainty. Certainty in Rome did not mean privacy, it meant witnesses. The ritual's procedures shaped the woman's life in ways that legal texts reveal only indirectly. The praenuga's sworn testimony could be decisive. The physician, writing down his observations, translated the open complexities of a human body into a text. Together, these acts transformed a moment into an archival trace, something that could be summoned years later in courtrooms or family quarrels. For Livia, the result was a new legal identity. She became, in the eyes of public law and familial recognition, the wife of Marcus Petronius Rufus, with whatever dowry, status, and obligations came with that recognition. It is important to underline the coercive atmosphere that surrounded this conversion of intimacy into evidence. Coercion in Roman marriage did not always resemble what modern readers expect as violence. It took the form often of social pressure, the narrowing of acceptable choices, and the threat of ruin for noncompliance. "Do not resist," a phrase whispered to Livia, operated as a summary of social expectation. Resistance had costs: a stained reputation, legal challenges, even the loss of a dowry. The ritual's choreography made refusal both technically possible and perilous. Women could sometimes exert agency, negotiating dowries, contesting marriages, but the institutional pressures arrayed against them were formidable. The ritual apparatus was designed to minimize ambiguity and maximize enforceability. After the event, there was a formalization. The praenuba could swear, the physician could supply a short record, and the household could assert that the marriage had been consummated and that the bride's status was appropriate. These statements could be summoned if a dispute arose, say if a man later challenged the legitimacy of an heir or a husband sought to punish what he called infidelity. Roman courts and social customs preferred witnesses and written records. The ritual supplied both, insisting on a kind of publicness that turned private life into a ledger. And then, for reasons both theological and political, this entire suite of practices started to vanish from the record. Late antique Christian writers attacked what they saw as obscene rites and idolatrous customs. Augustine's moral critiques painted pagan ceremonies as morally bankrupt, while writers such as Arnobius and Lactantius used accounts of such rituals as polemical tools in their broader campaign against paganism. As Christian supremacy grew in the 4th and 5th centuries, ecclesiastical authorities sought to reorder marriage around different principles: sacramental theology, clerical oversight, and a vocabulary that emphasized spiritual union rather than a household's transfer of property. Practices that once served as popular, local ways of producing proof were stigmatized, suppressed, or transformed. The consequence of this shift was twofold. On one hand, certain ritual objects and practices were deliberately delegitimized and removed from public life. The wooden figure, the profane gestures, the household-centered verification, these could be framed as relics of a morally corrupt past and omitted from respectable accounts. On the other hand, the Christian reinterpretation affected what writers chose to record. Pagan customs that could be used as rhetorical ammunition against older religious forms were often preserved in hostile accounts, but everyday techniques of household verification were more likely to be quietly abandoned and thus fall into silence. The result is that the archaeological and textual evidence we have is patchy. Some details are preserved precisely because they were scandalous, while other routine practices simply evaporated in the process of cultural reform. This erasure complicates modern historians' attempts to reconstruct what happened. We must rely on piecemeal legal formulations, on medical fragments that survive in copied manuscripts, and on polemical descriptions from hostile authors whose primary aim was not impartial documentation. Scholars therefore proceed with caution, distinguishing between what appears in multiple sources and what seems to be a rhetorical flourish. Some of the most vivid phrases we encounter come from fathers of the church who meant to shock their readers. When Augustine writes about obscene objects or actions, he often frames them to elicit disgust and to justify a spiritual alternative. That does not mean the rituals did not exist. It means that their representation is filtered through theological battles. Livia's private experience, so carefully orchestrated, rarely leaves her any direct voice. Women like her are present in the margins of legal documents, in passing references in moral literature, or as nameless figures in anecdotal collections. Roman women rarely wrote legal defenses that survive. Their perspectives are mediated through the voices of men, jurists, moralists, physicians. The result is a historical silence that feels deliberate. It is not only that sources are fragmentary, it is that the practices themselves were intended to be internal to the household and to the female world, and the public records that survived were those created by men or by later critics. We must therefore reconstruct Livia's subjectivity carefully, honoring the limits of our evidence. She may have felt humiliation, relief, resignation, fear, or a complex knot of emotions. Any attempt to fix a single emotion risks flattening an individual into an archetype. That silence creates a double erasure. First, the ritual itself, its objects, its ceremonies, is marginalized or condemned out of the historical record. Second, the women who experienced it remain largely voiceless. The legal apparatus that required witnesses and documentation also minimized the chance that a woman's private testimony would stand alone. The pronuba, a matron who could speak, was given the role precisely because her social standing made her testimony acceptable. The result is a historical silence that feels deliberate. It is not only that sources are fragmentary, it is that the practices themselves were intended to be internal to the household and to the female world, and the public records that survived were those created by men or by later critics. We must therefore reconstruct Livia's subjectivity carefully, honoring the limits of our evidence. She may have felt humiliation, relief, resignation, fear, or a complex knot of emotions. Any attempt to fix a single emotion risks flattening an individual into an archetype. That silence creates a double erasure. First, the ritual itself, its objects, its ceremonies, is marginalized or condemned out of the historical record. Second, the women who experienced it remain largely voiceless. The legal apparatus that required witnesses and documentation also minimized the chance that a woman's private testimony would stand alone. The pronuba, a matron who could speak, was given the role precisely because her social standing made her testimony acceptable. The bride, however, was often treated less as a subject and more as an element to be confirmed. This structural inequality is not merely a moral failing, it is a functional component of the system that privileged households and patrilineal inheritance over individual autonomy. Yet the story does not end with disappearance. It reappears in the condemnations of the converted, in the caricatures of pagan custom preserved by Christian writers, and in occasional legal treatises that betray the continuities between Roman and post-Roman family law. The Christian reconfiguration of marriage reframed many of the same questions: how to secure heirs, how to settle dowries, how to regulate sexual behavior, in different language and with different institutional backing. Bishops and councils began to assert authority over marital disputes, and public confession and canonical penalties introduced new mechanisms for dealing with sexual and marital transgressions. The private household rituals of old were increasingly incompatible with a Christianity that aimed to assert centralized moral and ritual authority. In discussing this transformation, we must be attentive to the ways polemic skews our view. When we read Augustine calling certain practices obscene, we should notice that his argument was not a disinterested ethnography. The polemicists sought to protect a nascent religious order and to delegitimize older forms of social life. That motive colors their testimony, making it dangerous to accept their descriptions at face value. At the same time, their very hostility is evidence that the practices they condemn were real enough to cause concern. Something happened on those wedding nights that deeply troubled the emerging Christian moral imagination. The ritual's architecture helps explain why it drew such ire and why it is today so easily erased. It married a local, household-centered logic with overt physicality and symbolic objects that priests and bishops could depict as grotesque or immoral. By portraying pagan rites as obscene, Christian writers made them unfit for polite preservation. Communities that converted often dismantled or repurposed the semantic scaffolding of household religion. Wooden idols were burned or hidden, certain rites were forbidden or adapted into liturgical ceremonies that lacked their original forensic function. As a historical result, the practices lost their institutional foothold and faded into private memory or were remembered only through hostile caricature. The episode raises questions we still struggle with. What counts as a legitimate source? How do we weigh hostile testimony? And why do some cultural practices vanish while others endure? The case of Livia and Mutinus Tutinus is instructive because it reveals how institutions use ritual to transform subjective experience into collective proof. The wedding night becomes less a moment of consummation than a procedure for eliminating doubt. It is a mechanism of governance located at the intimate intersection of law, medicine, religion, and women's lived experience. In reconstructing such scenes, historians must balance narrative clarity with evidentiary caution. We can paint the torches, the veil, the pranuba's steady gaze. We can describe the physician making brief notations and the pranuba later swearing an oath. We can observe that later critics, Augustine, Arnobius, Lactantius, found such practices intolerable and used them as proof of pagan depravity. Yet every descriptive turn should be couched in the humility of fragmentary evidence. Sources suggest, authors report, scholars debate. The result is not a melodramatic revelation, but a sober excavation of how a society managed risk and legitimacy in a world without central registry systems or modern paternity tests. There is a moral complexity here that resists simple judgments. On the one hand, the ritual commodified a woman's body in ways that feel alien and coercive from a modern liberal perspective. On the other hand, Roman families operated with a logic where certainty about heirs and property could mean survival. The pranuba was not merely a coercive agent. She embodied an older social contract that respected marriage as a communal institution. For some women, being recognized as a legitimate wife in this system meant security, confirmation of dowry rights, protection against slander, integration into the husband's household. The very practices that appear dehumanizing to us also provided legal clarity and, in some situations, social protection. But clarity came at a price. The asymmetry of legal voice, who could speak and be believed, meant that women's narratives were often subordinated to men's records. The physician's shorthand could be decisive, while the bride's protest, if any, might be marginalized as hysteria, shame, or confusion. This imbalance is part of the story. Gendered power shaped what kinds of evidence were plausible and whose testimony was admissible. When Christian writers later depicted or condemned the ritual, they were doing more than moralizing. They were participating in a cultural revolution that reshaped memory. The idols were removed, the rites denounced, and new ecclesiastical forms of marriage gradually took precedence. With that shift, certain techniques of household verification were either abandoned or absorbed into church practice in altered forms. The result is a historical palimpsest. Traces of the old remain, but they are overwritten by new theological and legal frameworks. What then does it mean that Rome, or rather later Roman and Christian authorities, wanted this night erased? Erasure is both deliberate and accidental. In some cases, it was deliberate. Bishops wanted to cleanse communities of what they considered immoral. In others, it was a side effect. As new institutions provided alternate mechanisms for regulating marriage and inheritance, older practices simply lost their utility and faded. The very act of forgetting is itself a form of power. Those who decide which rituals are respectable are also those who shape the archive that later generations will inherit. If we stand beneath the oil lamp of history and look at Livia's doorway, we see more than a scandalous oddity. We see a system that turned kinship and sex into questions to be settled by witnesses and scribes. We see how religious reform and political change can render an entire set of practices invisible. And we see the human stakes of this erasure: the absence in the record of women's voices, the difficulty of reconstructing intimate lives, and the moral uncertainties of judging the past by our standards. The shocking wedding night tradition Rome wants to erase forever therefore tells us something about power and memory. Rituals are not only acts of faith or spectacle, they are instruments of legal and social ordering. The household's insistence on witnesses and records turned a private night into a public event. Later authorities, seeking to remake society in the image of new orthodoxy, moved to suppress those old rituals. In doing so, they also shaped what would be remembered and what would be lost. We should end not with neat conclusions, but with questions. How do societies decide which intimate practices to record and which to repress? What do absences in the archive tell us about the lives of ordinary people? How might Livia's inner life, whatever it was, differ from the archival trace that survives her name? These are the questions that keep historians returning to the hearth and the doorway, to the draped block of wood and the pronuba's oath. If this reconstruction surprised you, tell us where you're watching from and what shocked you most. Subscribe for more explorations of the hidden practices that shaped history, and watch our next video on Roman law and family life to go deeper into how ancient societies, law, and memory